Don't worry, despite the opening I'm about to give, this is not another Mindshift video on slavery, though they're pretty good, and entirely justified because the slavery apologetics just keep coming. However, we're going to be talking about something a bit different today that is adjacent to racism and slavery in the Bible, and that is the curse of Ham. And I actually want to clear some things up that helps the Christian side of the argument, but I also want to expose some of the other problems that are under the surface. There's just some ugly facts of history, like Christians participated in slavery. In fact, they did more than participate. They preached it. They theologized it. They claimed it was divinely inspired. And then when modern morality caught up enough, they had the audacity to claim that since they helped stop it, that's the only part of the story we should focus on. So I say all of this because I want to be very, very, very clear from the start. This episode is not me arguing that the Bible does not condone slavery, because it absolutely does. Elsewhere than what we're going to cover today, repeatedly and unambiguously. But today, the focus is not just how Christians inherited the concept, condoning, and allowance of slavery from the Bible, but then how they also escalated it, how they put it in where it didn't belong, biblically speaking. Because for what we're talking about today, the curse of Ham, well, that isn't biblical doctrine. It's a historical fabrication created to solve a moral problem that Christianity didn't want to face. So let me back up. Let's talk about the text itself. This all happens in Genesis 9, and it's pretty quick here. I can just read it to you starting in verse 18. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both of their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what the youngest son had done to him, he said, and this is the entire curse, get ready, this is where everything stems from. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Honestly, that sounds more problematic than anything else. And let Canaan be his servant. Ending by saying, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So that's it. That little passage is where, for centuries, the idea of racism and slavery was justified from the pulpit. So we're going to get to exactly what that message was and how they arrived at that. But first, I want to fill in some more of the context for you. Let's talk about Canaan. Canaan is the son of Ham, and what leads to be the Canaanite people, so the story goes. This isn't the first or only time that the Bible will do this. We see something similar with Jacob and Esau. Esau becomes Edom. Edom is forever cursed because God hated Esau even when he was in the mother's womb. You know, fun stuff like that, where we get specific people that are tied to people groups that are later not favored by God, and thus we get all the justification we want for enslavement and genocide and stealing their women and raping their girls, things like that. The Canaanites were not African, as so many of these preachers would try to get you to believe, that somehow from these three sons, Ham was the black one that led to the descendants of Africa, and thus slavery is totally okay because it was his curse. A curse that, by the way, Noah did, not God did. It's just amazing how twisted this story had to get for it to be used in the way that it was. And you might say, well, Brandon, that doesn't sound like you have a problem with God or the Bible. It sounds like you have a problem with bad people under the guise of Christianity doing bad things and using the Bible as justification. Correct, but also that's because we picked a verse this time that actually doesn't justify slavery, and it goes to show how easy it is to utilize the Bible in whatever fashion you want, because the Bible, which was supposedly written by a perfect mind of perfect foreknowledge and all power, couldn't do better when looking into his crystal ball and to see all of the horror and harm that would come from these very vague words, and yet still chose to write them down in this fashion if this God were true. What's actually happening here is we have an ancient text, a collection of ancient texts in different narratives and different genres, written at different times with different purposes in a different voice, being used by people however they want, to justify whatever they want. This is the real story of Christianity, a source material that you can use to ground whatever you want. That's why it's harmful, not because it can be abused, but because it is abused. It has always been abused, and it will always be abused because it claims things that aren't true, like an objective morality, a God, a chosen people, patriarchs who can do curses that lead to outcomes that we should just be okay with because at the end of the day, they're kind of from God. I could go on forever about why this is just one of many examples that exposes the harm about this religion. But I do want to get back on track here. I just don't want to hear a bunch of excuses later about how, yeah, you're right, but it doesn't matter. I am right, and it does matter. And as long as we hold up this Bible or this God or this religion on a pedestal like we have been, we will continue to condone the harm that happens from it. So if you're a Christian and you recognize that the curse of Ham is not biblical and it's been taken out of context and it's been used unfairly to harm other people for the desires of those in power, good on you, but you haven't gone far enough. That's one of the points here. Back on track though. What this is an ideological myth, an origin myth, a story that tries to explain the origins or reasons behind natural phenomenon, social customs, cult practices, the world at large. This is what most mythology is doing. It's trying to fill a gap where we didn't have all the knowledge and say, this is how we arrived here. This is why. Here's the story that explains it. And in this particular case, it is retroactive, meaning after the fact, justification for Israelite dominance and destruction of the Canaanite people. And that's the context for the Genesis 9 story. It's reflecting later political realities to explain a conquest in the past. It is not predicting the future. Let me move into talking about the timeline here so that you can understand how we know that. Genesis is finalized, written down, amalgamated, and collected around the 5th or 6th century BCE. Yes, the oral tradition would have gone back further than that. This is during or shortly after their time in captivity in Babylon. But when do they think the events that are talked about in Genesis 9 happened? Well, we can utilize that same source material, the Bible, to get the answer. Noah is said to be 10 generations after Adam. The genealogies are all over Genesis. You can look at chapters 5, 10, or 11. Working backwards from later biblical chronologies, we can see that somewhere between 23 and 2500 BCE is when the flood would have happened. Some even give it an exact date, 2348. So this is all based off the internal biblical chronology, not historical evidence, which is the other thing that's hilarious here. For every progressive Christian that understands that Genesis is allegorical and doesn't try to take anything literal like a 7-day creation, a 6,000-year-old earth, or a worldwide flood where sloths come from South America, yet then within the same context of a story, these being the only people on earth after an ark that saved these 8 people, can go right back into a literal reading and profess how they understand that the curse of Ham is the excuse to the slaughter of the Canaanites or the later enslavement of Africans. Like, it's so asinine. And again, not all Christians believe all parts of that, but some can go halfway and then still mess up completely, and some are just believing all of the nonsense all the way through. But my point here is simple. Using even the most absolutely charitable givings of time frame about the earliest this could have been written down, and when it's believed the latest that the flood could have happened, we're well over 1,000-year gap, much more, but being ultra helpful. It's a pretty stark contrast to the claim that Moses wrote the Torah. Clearly, the author is not an eyewitness or anything close. So then the story must have been written much later to reflect later theology, later politics, later warfare, and later moral assumptions. And by the way, that explains a lot, like why Canaan is cursed and not Ham, because the Canaanites were the current enemies of Israel. How convenient that this curse that happened thousands of years ago, when written down finally, just so happens to align with Israel's conquest. The narrative function is clear. It is trying to legitimize domination, destruction, enslavement, and genocide, and provide divine rationale after the fact. This retrofitting, by the way, of the Bible is nothing new. Jesus himself did it, which is an episode I'm going to be making soon. The New Testament writers, the gospel writers especially, did this like crazy. So it's not like something that modern American Christians that maybe aren't true Christians have messed up recently. The Bible, the source material, the Hebrew words, the Torah, has always been utilized to help whoever has the power to do whatever they already wanted to do. And I'll show you that here a bit more at the end. Let me get back on track. A lot of tangents today. I apologize. Getting back to the timeline issue, it works on both sides. If you think about when it was written versus the event it describes, but then you think about the transatlantic slave trade, what this story tries to justify, or I should say, what Christians here utilize the story to try to justify. So for over 1,500 years of Jewish reading and interpretation, there was zero racial reading in this. There was zero African identification in this, and zero doctrine of blackness as a curse. Clearly, we cannot, just with this little bit of information, just the time frame explanation, be foolish enough to think that this is an actual biblical doctrine that just so happened to be correctly interpreted at the exact time when Europeans wanted free labor at the cost of the slave trade. But that's what you would have to believe if you're the kind of person that ascribes the curse of Ham as being about how black people are lesser than, or owning them as slaves is totally okay, which short version of what the curse of Ham is in its interpretation later on by those in power. So how did the story change? When did this reinterpretation, rewrite happen? Well, as Europeans begin to encounter Africa and Africans, geography already is getting retrofitted onto Genesis. Ham becomes African. We have to explain this. If we take that one part of the verse that says, from these three sons, you know what, let me read it exactly. I'm getting the words wrong. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Well, now the earth is a bit bigger than it used to be. And I'm not talking about Egypt, which was known back then, or things like that. I'm talking about the whole of Africa, the whole of Asia, eventually the Americas. We have to come up biblically with how we're going to explain this. And you don't go back to Adam and Eve because you have the flood, so you go back to the sons of Noah. And if Ham is the cursed one, then Ham must be the black one. I mean, honestly, it's kind of that ridiculously simple. Canaan disappears entirely, by the way. It's not useful anymore. And I want to make sure you're picking up both of these points. You have the authors of Genesis in the 5th and 6th century BCE writing down a previously oral tradition in a way that justifies their current behavior. And then that current behavior, the destruction of the Canaanites, is lost to time and use later when another group of people in power want to take the same story but apply it differently to their own evil ends, the enslavement of Africans. This is what we would call motivated theology, which might be the exact opposite of exegesis. Hey, if the text doesn't go far enough, Christians just take it to where you need it. Now, I wasn't sure if I wanted to include this next section because I actually haven't covered it much yet on the channel, and I think it deserves a really proper explanation because there's some things that just aren't true with how it's usually used in these kinds of conversations. But let's talk quickly about the slave Bible. There really was an abridged Bible printed for teaching enslaved people. And let me give you the technical term here. Select parts of the Holy Bible for the use of Negro slaves in the British West India Islands, published in London, 1807. It removed huge portions of scripture, commonly summarized as like over 90% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New. What was its intended purpose? To strip out the themes that could produce hope, equality, or revolt. I think there's a few interesting points here. One is that they knew that the Bible was dangerous to their power because the Bible, in its full form, can be used to so many different extremes and justifications. And they didn't want the slaves seeing that and utilizing it to group and justify their own takeover. No, only they got to do that. So you've got to remove most of the Exodus, liberation from slavery. We can't have that. We need to get rid of all that stupid wording in the New Testament about equality found in Christ. The goal was simply to emphasize the parts about needing to be obedient and docile, and remove any parts that would allude to freedom. And the link here, by the way, the reason I even brought up the slave Bible is the shared strategy. It's all about controlling meaning, not honest reading. And I don't even know if honest reading is really possible at this point with what the Bible has become. That's an issue for another day. But these are the same two things, and it's with a related topic. The proof text invention that is the curse of Ham, and the content control, which is the slave Bible. What do we see here about what Christians are willing to do? Well, if the Bible doesn't say what you need it to, you can just make it say that. And if the Bible says something you don't like or that would hurt you, you can remove it. Christianity has always been like this. It has been something that is managed by those in power for their ends. It's so simple when you can just zoom out far enough. You know, I've said before that meaning wasn't discovered, that it was manufactured when we're talking specifically about the Bible. But this is like the perfect case example to show you exactly what I mean by that, how exactly the manufacturing happens. As far as I can see, there's 3 layers of manufacturing going on here. First, you have the manufactured genealogy. Genesis curses Canaan, not Ham, but pro-slavery theology quietly shifts the curse to Ham, then to all Hamites, then to all Africans, because I guess those are the same now, and then just to black people in general. And that's how you get articles like the one I saw the other day. I'll put it up on the screen. I think it was the leader of the KKK, which no surprise here, but talking about how biblically he doesn't think black people can be saved. It never ceases to shock me how awful and stupid people can be, and religion is just the perfect tool for them. So there's the first manufacturing. The second is biology. The Bible does not link the curse to skin color, period, because that wouldn't make any sense. It's 3 sons of the same father. So you've got to do some manufacturing. You've got to start with curse and then move to lineage and then phenotype. And then you get this permanent inferiority. Even that permanence is actually the third manufacturing. What does Genesis 9 say? What is it really talking about? It's a family oracle. But the pro-slavery theology turns it into a universal and timeless decree. That's crazy. Like, how many different ways do you have to get this verse wrong to do this? And yet, not a ton of opposition, by the way, for a long time about the curse of Ham being applied to black people. An important and interesting question here is, well, if we have these other verses in the Bible that do so easily condone slavery, like Leviticus 25:44 through 46, why not just use those? Why go through all this work? And I think the easy answer is that using a verse like this goes even further back, which adds more legitimacy to it. This is something that happened in Genesis. This is something that is tied to the new world after the second remaking, straight from Noah himself, and it racializes the slavery. Now, you can make good arguments in Leviticus 25:44 through 46 that because it is only allowed to buy and own slaves for life as property and pass them down as inheritance from the nations around you, that we get the same kind of closer ethnic-based slavery. But if you can convince people that the curse of Ham is specific to that and to black people, then you can just have a heyday in your transatlantic slave trade. I'm open to other issues or reasons, but I think sometimes it is the simplest answer. A few last things here, because I just want to, as we look at this story for the first time really on the channel, make sure we're covering all angles. Some people might even be confused. Why did Noah do this curse? What was the big deal? It was Noah's fault. Noah was the one who sinned. He's the one who got drunk. He's the one who was exposing himself. Why punish Ham or Ham's descendants for this? And there's 3 main interpretations there. I'll cover them really quick. One is just a shame issue, which probably makes the most sense for the ancient Near East at this time. The other 2 sons were careful, and they walked backwards. They made sure they didn't see his nakedness, and they covered him up in a way that would protect his dignity, but not Ham. Although, again, see, the story is so vague. It's not like we understand that Ham snuck in and tried to catch his father like this. This was something that happened because of Noah's bad behavior, not Ham's. Others have made the argument that the phrase uncovered his nakedness is a euphemism, either for some kind of sexualization or even as far as incest or sexual assault. Tied to that is kind of the third interpretation, that it was about a power or dominance thing. Ham was shaming his father by making sure that others saw his nakedness because he went to get his brothers. But it doesn't really matter. It's just amazing to see, again, even there, how many times Christians have had to try to invent something or make it as bad as possible to justify the curse. Well, no, you don't understand. The curse of Ham, the curse of Canaan makes perfect sense if you understand how awful and evil Ham's actions were against Noah. Apologetics is so stupid and silly and backwards. Your perfect patriarch that was the one chosen by God to be saved from a world of unrighteousness, and just about as soon as he can, after surviving the flood, makes a vineyard, gets drunk, gets naked, embarrasses himself, and curses his son for his own folly. And believers took that story and first tried to utilize it as a retrofitting for the justification of the destruction of Canaan, and then later for race-based slavery. When will the world grow up? Surely not at the hands of religion. We're nearing the end here. I do just want to cover very quickly some of the typical objections you get, and I tried to do so at the beginning, but the first one is going to be, well, hey, Brandon, that's not what Christians believe today, or that's not what all Christians believe. So once again, moral progress came after theology, after God was done speaking and explaining things and commanding things. Got it. That's not the win you think it is. Just like it's not the win you think it is when you say, well, hey, without Christians, we might not have stopped the slave trade so soon. It's a trite analogy, but I don't give credit to the arsonist firefighter. Well, Brandon, people are going to misuse the Bible. Cool, then admit that the Bible is dangerously unstable and obviously then not the product of a perfect mind with foreknowledge and omnipotence. Or admit that it is all of those things, and thus then your God is inept or evil or apathetic. You can't have it all the ways you want it. Here's the main point we're going to close out. It's pretty funny to me that the larger pattern here is that God and or religion and or the Bible and or theology, whatever you want to say, always seems to side with power. God's will, the will of the creator of the universe, coincidentally, seems clearest to whoever holds authority at the time. No one else sees an issue here. It's just so obviously sad to me. And again, this episode isn't me trying to clear the Bible's good name. The Bible has a horrific name. It says many horrific things when you even read it correctly and in context. And yet still, believers had to go further. They wanted their cake and they wanted to eat it too. And they wanted it with all the frosting and toppings and all the other extraordinary things that they desired. How bad is your religion when you already have a horrible source material, but then your believers go out of the way to change it or lie about it to make it even worse, again, for their benefit? Wouldn't it be cool if religion, God, the Bible, whatever, actually confronted injustice instead of continually adapting itself to it, adjusting itself to it, being the motivator, the reasoning, the excuse for it? But that's it. I'm done. I hope that you enjoyed this. This was a pretty different episode for me, so definitely give me some feedback here and let me know what you think. I'll see you Tuesday with a new one, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, Chris, Grant, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, yep, the Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn. My Humanist heroes: Chris, Craig, James, Jarrod, and Kristi. My Atheist advocates: Aquitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jeremy, Jugs, Julie, Malcom, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. Would you consider joining these fine people?